Well, Konrad Jarausch, thank you so much for coming in to visit with us on North Carolina Bookwatch about your book, Out of Ashes, which is a whole history of Europe during the 20th century. You lived part of that century as a youngster growing up during and right after the war in Germany. Tell us about that experience and whether or not it influenced this book.
It absolutely drove the book. I had the feeling I had something to say about this subject because my parents were born about in 1900, and I was born in 1941, and so together we cover the century, and the century had enormous implications on our family because my father was drafted in World War I, but no longer quite served at the front. The family business went under in the Great Depression in Berlin. He couldn't get a job in the Third Reich for a while, and then was drafted and died on the Russian front in 1942. And I grew up as a semi-orphan. My mother had to start working again, so I am, supportive of women who have to do this, and so the post-war period was difficult for us.
What was it like did you have a sense as a 5-year-old as the war ended that this terrible destruction that you describe in your book, did you think of that as just normal times, or was it?
Well, we ended up playing in the ruins. I mean, because that's what was around. I, once found a rifle and pointed it at my mother, at the edge of a wood, and she was not amused because you never knew when you pulled the trigger if it was still loaded, and so on. And so, that's the environment, and children being children, they will make something of it. But then when you're a teenager and you grow up, I was a rebellious kid because the parent generation had screwed it up about as big as you can screw it up. If you, ruin not only your country, but the neighboring countries as well, and commit unspeakable crimes in the process, then, whose authority were you going to believe?
Was there a burden of guilt that you felt was on your shoulders just because you happened to be German, even though you had nothing to do with that destruction?
Yeah, well, when I was a Boy Scout and we made a bicycle trip to the Alsace and asked the local Alsatians in German for directions, they would stonewall us, nothing doing, and when we asked in broken French, they would answer in German and tell us where to go. I mean, that very clearly showed, their feeling. And, it goes on all the way to the United States when I was a student. And one of my dates was a Jewish girl, who immediately started talking about how her family had suffered. And I said, well, my father died in Russia. End of story, end of date. Another young Jewish girl was my girlfriend for a while because we shared something, in an experience of suffering, from these terrible events. So, these things, if you were a German and if you were interested in history, you lived with it both on the level of your own family, on the level of your country's politics, and on the level of international contacts, because other people would always react to you as if you were in some ways responsible for something which you couldn't have changed because I was 4 years old when the war ended.
Well, do you feel liberated, although you're an American now, do you feel liberated now that Germany has become the sort of central character and leader of the European alliance, and in a healthy way?
Well, on some level, I'm very pleased. I mean, for a whole while, when I was a foreign student in the United States, I didn't want to go back to Germany. And as I said in one of my other books, and somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, I flew into Frankfurt, and the custom guard had his tie sideways, the button open, and he was relaxed. And I said, okay, now I can come back, because they had gotten over the authoritarian part. On that level, I think, in many ways, it's a success story, even if there are skinheads and people whom we don't like. On another level, I find it very sad because if sensible people had prevailed in the 19-teens, before the First World War, we might have been spared.
Well, we wouldn't have had
enormous
this great book, Out of Ashes, that you've described this. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this on North Carolina Bookwatch very soon. Thank you.